So in this video we're going to, now having created a Shroud grid, we're going to create the code that actually clears a set position over an object, so that you can then move an object around and be like, hey look, I can uncover you, Shroud, I can discover things and find out places and go there and stuff. So to clear the grid, the first thing we need to do is create a template which will hold the values that we will use to effectively update and overwrite the Shroud with, which will then clear it. So essentially we need to create a smaller grid which we will fill with zeros in the shape of the area we want to clear, which will basically be a circle, and then in the little corners we then put ones to fill the rest of the grid out with ones. This way we have a nice little shape that we go, boom, stamp this over the top of the current Shroud grid in this position, and that will clear the values and clear the Shroud. Now you could do this with a CSV file, a comma separated value file. You could manually put in all the ones and zeros to create a file, to create a template, but I'm going to do it by actually creating a little bit of a script that just does a little distance check on the radius and goes, okay, this is the template we're going to use. That way it can be changed on the fly, and you can use the same script to specify different sizes for different objects. Now the advantage of a CSV is that you would be able to create a field of view arc, for instance, and say, okay, it's only going to clear the Shroud in the direction you're looking. You might be able to do something like that, and you can create better kind of custom shapes. And you can then just use the load CSV to function to then load it into a grid for you. If you do that, you have to be aware that the CSV loads string values, so you'll need to convert them. For what I'm doing with this, I'm going to create a circle because that's the most effective generally, and most sort of well used kind of in games. It's generally you clear the fog with a circle. So I'm going to create a script, and we're going to call that Shroud clear grid setup. Let's try that again. Shroud clear grid setup. There we go. And we're just going to use this script to create a grid and then return the grid to where it's called. So I'll just do a little comment to the top that says create the clear grid template. We're going to take in two arguments. We're going to take in the site radius from argument 0 and the grid size from argument 1. Now you might be wondering, why am I putting the arguments into a local variable when I can just use the argument variable in this script? And this is a case of saying, well, it's when you finish the script, if you pass it on to someone else, it's immediately clear what these values are and what you're doing with them. Whereas if it is just argument 0 and argument 1, you'd be like, that means nothing. That's not a meaningful name to give a variable. So I'm effectively putting it in a local variable to, first of all, make the name more meaningful and obvious what its intent is, but also, again, if you're debugging and there's a problem with the script, you can see what the local variable is a bit easier if it's localized. Now, having done this, we're going to put a little bit of safety code in, because if you're making a function that someone else is going to use, you need to put a little bit of a check in to make sure they only pass as parameters variables that will actually work. So the first thing we need to verify is that the grid size that they've given us to use to, or that is passed to this function, is odd. if we look at our grid of cells here for the template we're creating, we want the center point to be in its own row and column, which means it needs to be odd. If it was even, this central dot would sit on the in between the two middle rows and two middle columns, so we need it to be odd. So the first check we need to make sure of is, have we been given a value for this grid size that is odd? And if it isn't odd, we need to make it odd by adding one. So we're going to say if grid size mod 2 equals 0. Now if you divide by 2 and there's a remainder, then your number's odd. If you divide by 2 and there's no remainder, your number's even. So by using the modulus operator to divide by 2 and look at the remainder, if it's 0, we found an odd number and we're going to increase this grid size by 1. Grid size plus, there we go. Now we're going to make a temporary grid object, or rather we're going to create the grid object currently into a temporary variable, and at the end of the function we're then going to pass this grid object back to where it was called. So we'll say var temp grid, try spelling var correctly, there we go, equals ds grid grif. What's a ds grif? Create, and we're going to use the variable of the Shroud grid grid size comma grid size. So that tells us that to create a clear grid that is of the correct size. Now we need to find the center of the grid, and we're going to do that by dividing by 2 and taking the whole number with the divisor operator. So we're going to say var cent, which we center, equals grid size div 2. So essentially what's happening here is, if we look at this template grid here, which is 9 by 9, we're saying divide the width and height, divide it by 2, size of this grid, divide it by 2, and get the whole number integer that's being returned and throw away the remainder. Now in the case of 9 divided by 2 is 4 remainder 1, throw away the remainder, we've got 4. Now looking at this you might think, well hang on, that's going to put us in this 4th column here and the 4th row. However, the first row is row 0, so the 5th row is actually, the 5th row and column are actually number 4 as it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So by going the grid size div 2, throwing away the remainder, taking the whole number of divisor, we then get the central row and column in this grid. Now we can use this center value to find the maximum radius that the clear template can be, and we can use that to use a bit of safety code to cap the site radius in case someone put a silly big radius that's bigger than the grid size. So we can use this center value we've just calculated, which is 4, but what that gives us is these rows here. And the problem we have is that when you have this radius of 4 that takes you to there and there, this means that on the diagonal that's going to be more than 4, but we want that. So actually using center and saying, okay, whatever the radius is, the max is whatever the center value is, because that's half of the grid size, that doesn't actually give us enough of a radius to effectively draw a circle. What you'd have is just a single 0 here and the rest would be 1s, and then we have this weird like little point sticking out of a box. which wouldn't look right. So what we need to do is actually add 1 to center. So we need to say if site radius is greater than cent plus 1, then site radius equals cent plus 1. So if the radius is too big to fit the template, then we reduce it to the maximum possible value. Now, having done this, we can loop through the grid and figure out what values to put in it. As we've done before, we need to create 2 nested for loops that will then let us step through the grid. So x equals 0, x is less than the grid size, x plus plus, and then for y equals 0, y is less than grid size, y plus plus. So within this loop, we now have access to the individual cell. And what we need to figure out is, what is the distance away this cell is from the center point? So we effectively have the center point, and we have one of these cells which we're currently sitting at, and we calculate the distance, and if the distance is less than the radius, then we flag this cell with a 0 to say, yep, we're clearing this cell. So we'll do that by saying var dist equals point distance, and it's the distance from the center, so cent to x, y. So now we've figured out how far the cell is away from the center cell. We say if dist is less than or equal to site radius, it's 1an radius, then we're within the radius, else we're outside the radius. If we're in the radius, then we want this cell to be clear. So we'll say temp grid, use the accessor, x, y equals 0, and it's clear. Copy that, paste it, change it to 1. That's outside the radius, so it's a 1. Having done all this, we get down to the bottom here and we simply say return temp grid. And that's it. That should just create a clearing circle for us to use. Now I should note at this point that you don't actually need to destroy the temp grid. You don't need to call a ds grid destroy temp grid. Firstly, because there's nowhere to put it. If you put it in here, then you're destroying it before you return it, and you can't put it afterwards because return ends the script. But also because what this ds create does is it creates a data structure somewhere else and then returns to this variable the a reference pointer to that data structure. And what we're doing is we're returning that reference pointer to where it's called. So when we throw away this temporary variable, we're not losing anything and it's fine. What we now need to do is hook this up to our red circle object. So I'm going to close this and open red circle object. Now we're going to add a room in other, room start, because we need to do this after Shroud has done its thing and created the actual Shroud grid. So we're going to set a Shroud radius, and I'll make it 5.5. Now it's important that there's a 0.5 or about that. If you can't use a whole number of 5, as we see on this grid here, a whole number will give you this line to there and that line to there, and not give you the rest of the column and row. So to get this shape, we actually need to have a radius of more than that. So about 5.5 should give us enough of a proper circle shape that we can actually do that. It'll function correctly and not look weird. We're then going to create our Shroud clear grid. And we're going to use the function script we just created to actually create the grid and return into this variable the pointer to where it's stored. So we go Shroud clear grid setup, and of course it needs a size, which would be Shroud radius, or rather it needs a radius and a size. So we go Shroud radius, and then we go obj Shroud dot clear grid size. Having done that, we've created it. We now actually need to get rid of this grid by adding a destroy event and saying ds grid destroy. What did I call it? I called it Shroud clear grid. Just paste that in there, and so now we've gotten rid of this grid that we created. Now we actually need to now that this red object circle has a shroud grid to clear, it needs to actually use that grid to clear the shroud. So we're going to need to create another script. We're going to call that script Shroud clear position. Just like that. And we will clear part of Shroud. Now the first thing we need to do is get the corresponding position in the Shroud grid based off the XY positions that this script will be passed. So we're going to have the two parameters for the XY position, and we recalculate the grid's position from those using div. So we're going to say var sx equals argument 0 div. There we go. Now for the grid size, we're going to say obj shroud dot grid size. Which is the value of 32 that we set for the cell size of the shroud. So now we have an XY position for the for where in the shroud grid we're going to be clearing the data. We've converted the room position that we're going to be sending it. However, we're going to need to offset this position because currently, firstly, we draw from the top left position of the template, and currently we have the calling instances object XY position. So currently we have our grid of the shroud covering the room, and the player has taken up a position in that grid, and it's going to call this script and say, okay, my XY position, clear these cells. But because we're drawing from the top left, it's going to draw this grid like offset to the right and down because it starts from the top left and it's going to start from the player's XY position. So it's just going to go boomf and draw it there in the wrong place. So what we need to do is offset it by moving it up and to the left. So we need to figure out what the center position is and subtract that from the XY position to offset it. So we need to find the half grid value, and we're going to call that var half, and it's going to be obj shroud dot clear grid size div 2. So whatever our clear grid size is that we're using, we're going to just halve it. And we only want the whole value integer, the whole integer value of this. And then we say sx minus equals half, sy minus equals half. So that simple little bit of maths and code there, we've just offset the grid up and to the left, so now the center of the grid is directly over the top of the player. So we can now loop through it and actually clear the grid. And once again, we need a set of nested for loops to loop through the grid and give us each position. So we're looping from 0 to the size of the clear grid, because we're going to be looping through the clear grid and using the positions to then convert to the Shroud's position. Whoops. Try typing the right damn thing. There we go. Okay, so now within these two nested fors, we have the position in the XY position within the Shroud. And we also have the XY position with SX and XY. We have the XY position within the Shroud that we want to clear. And within this loop we have the XY positions within the clear template that we're going to clear the Shroud to. So we need to grab the value from the Shroud clear grid by saying var f equals Shroud clear grid. Use the hash accessor x y. So we've grabbed the value for this cell within the clear grid. And we're only going to update it if it's a 0. If it's a 1, then we're not going to change anything. We don't want to update it. We only want to clear it if it says this is a 0. This is a cell we want to clear. So we say if f equals 0, and now we need to figure out the corresponding cell in the Shroud grid by using the SX and SY offsets. So we say obj Shroud dot Shroud grid. So accessing the main Shroud grid, we're using the accessor hash, and we're saying the offset x plus the current x cell, and the offset Shroud y plus the current y equals f. Now, I mean, you could put equals 0 in there. Makes no difference. But essentially that now overwrites the current position, Shroud position, with the data from the template, from the clear template. And that's all we need to do for that script. But we need to put it into the red circle object. And to do that, we're going to use the end step. I'm going to pop it in here, and all we do is we say Shroud position, Shroud clear position, Shroud clear position, x comma y. So we're now calling the script that we just created and said my XY position, clear it. Why is that an error? It's an error because there's a 0 there instead of a 1. Whoops. Got that wrong. Okay. So now there should not be an error. Go away, error. Is it just not updating? There we go. Okay, so now if I run this, it should work. So there we go. Instead of a big black rectangle, we now have a large black area with a little patch of green and a red thing in it. But if I right click, it moves and clears the grid. If I right click over here, we should uncover the blue squares. Now, what we need to do next is add fog, so that once you've been somewhere and moved on, that area then gets fogged over so that you can't quite see what's there, and that'll be the next video, which will hopefully have a little button for on the screen in like the, let's go bottom right, left, top, bottom, yeah, somewhere.